Okay, let's do it again. So it's my pleasure to present Pooran Memari today. She's giving the first keynote talk of the conference. And Pooran is a CNRS researcher at l'X Laboratory in Paris. And before that, she did a PhD in Sophia Antipolis with Jean-Daniel Boissonnat, and she worked at that time on geometric tomography, if I'm right. After that, she went for a postdoc in Caltech with Mathieu Desbrun. And there she worked on triangulations. And for a few years now, she's been working on point patterns. And she will tell us everything about that in the next hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So I don't know if you can hear me. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the organizers for this kind invitation. I'm really, really honored to be here, part of this event. Where we all come together to discuss our shared research interests around geometry and computing. So, so maybe I can sit down for this very first part so that I can have a big picture of the geometry of the room. And then I will just, to the technical part, I will just try to stand up, if you can still hear me, and talk about the details on the board. So I'm part of the geomerics team, where that we have called geomerics for geometry-driven numerics. So it's an INRIA research team as well as part of the l'X department lab at École Polytechnique IP Paris Institute. So our main focus is just divided into two categories, and my own research falls mainly in the very first category, which is geometry for shape processing. So today, indeed, what I will do is to share, indeed, my research journey on this synthesis of discrete distributions from a very methodological point of view to diverse applications. And I will show you how we can just, based on some intuitive geometric notions, derive indeed some new tools. So in this context of point pattern synthesis, for different applicative contexts, namely toward interactive editing. And at the very end, if I have time, I will talk also about some applications in accessibility. So the key, let's say, element here is still geometry, and we will provide some computational tools across different application scenarios. So I will mainly talk about, let's say, 5 quite different projects. Each of them are somehow targeting a new framework with new computational tools. You will see that they are quite straightforward and based on our really intuitive, geometric intuition, so which is our best friends here in this community. So what are what we call discrete distributions here? It's just, let's see it as a special like point process where each element, each point at the very first place represent the position of an element. So that would allow us to somehow study different phenomena that happen, let's say, and we try to represent them on a domain, namely in 2D. So the key element, indeed, of today's talk is this dimensionless element, basic geometric tool that we can barely see before it takes part of, indeed, a distribution configuration, indeed, on a domain representing a pattern. So that could be in the context of steeple art, object placement, or in other context of applications such as, for example, material appearance, where we are using these patterns for Monte Carlo rendering, smart city design, for example. We worked on reforestation. Indeed, we are trying to use these things as positions of different species in an ecosystem. So these are the diverse set of applications that we can consider for point patterns. And in this talk, we can also consider the cases where to each of these points are associated some attributes. You can attach any kind of information that you want to these elements that can be of different nature, not necessarily spatial coordinates, that can be, for example, in the context of, let's say, galaxies, that can be quite deep and complex, that can be masses attributed to this each galaxy, that can be their luminosity, etc., etc. And we can even have uncertain data on it, like as probability distributions. And of course, when we talk about such complex data, having a relevant analysis for this data would require some nice metric mixture that would be able to take into account different relevant metric to each of representative coordinates, etc., etc. So this is indeed an open question, and it's even a question that I tried to consider like years back. After my PhD, I wanted to just find an application for our big hammer that was a triangulation technique for statistical manifolds, and I just realized that even in the statistical research, this community, they don't have really good answer to these questions. But slightly after, I just found, let's say, a very first motivation to come back to these distributions in a much simpler context. So for me, that was a kind of a side project that I didn't know that could really impact my long-term research in the upcoming years. So that was in the context of virtual world authoring. So we were trying to indeed represent different ecosystems. For example, in this case, a Mediterranean one, through a distribution which represents only the canopy of different species. That could be different kinds of vegetation, big trees, or even going toward mushrooms, really small vegetation. So they have really, in biology, they have detailed data about these ecosystems, and these are the data that would allow them to somehow characterize different ecosystems. And we wanted to somehow do what we call discrete distribution synthesis here, to be able to, from such a kind of small input, extend this data to a larger domain with the same statistical features, but without any repetitive artifacts, etc., etc. So, and we wanted to have efficient techniques, and we didn't want to go, of course, through heavy machine learning techniques. So we wanted to do what we call example-based distribution synthesis. So given an exemplar, how to really extract the features and synthesize a new pattern that would have almost the same, at least appearance as what we had in between, at the beginning. So that was the very first motivation, and in order to just say a few words about related work there, at least in the context of point distribution, there are many different works just limited to points. I will come back to them, but the very key components here are either the category of methods that consider spectrum of point patterns, so by going through Fourier power spectrum and looking at the point patterns as noises and consider their, let's say, Fourier transform. So this is very well known in sampling community, and there are efficient tools there. And there is another category of, indeed, techniques considering more statistical tools like pair correlation functions. So I will come back to this notion just in one slide. And not all of these techniques are indeed extendable to other elements, namely disks. And the other challenge that we can also consider that is not really handled by most of them is the case of different classes with different attributes, as I mentioned before. So since a pair correlation function is the key element here, I would like to just give a very quick definition of it, at least with some illustrations. So it's indeed nothing else than a kind of average density with respect to distance between points. So what does it mean? It means that, for example, for these different point patterns that you can see, what we will have in the x-axis would be just the radius of like, let's say you are growing a circle around a point, and that would be the radius representing that circle. And on the y-axis, you will have indeed the number of neighbors that you would see around that distance. Okay, so, and what you would do usually is to average this for all the points. So these average pair correlation functions are very representative because, as you can see, that somehow captures for example, the first distance that you would have between different clusters of points will naturally appear in this PCF function. So nothing really magical. This is very useful because based on the, let's say, smoothness and, regular properties that it has, and the fact that you can normalize with respect to the density, you can use it, for example, for point pattern synthesis. What would be the synthesis algorithm that you would have here? Just you start, you somehow, if you want to, for example, synthesize a point pattern whose PCF is known, you can just simply target that, and by doing a kind of simple dart throwing, trying to converge to that average PCF. And with some refinement at the end, you would be able to indeed come up with quite similar patterns based on this simple algorithm. So what we wanted to do was to apply that to the, as I said, ecosystem context. And interestingly enough, there are not that many work there, mainly in terms of the relevant metric between disks. So the very basic distance that was considered before our work was a continuous distance between disks, and only 3 bins of discrete values for the case where canopies are intersecting each other. So it remains quite preliminary, and I've been asked to find a metric for it. I said, wow, okay, this is a very, very simple question for us coming from like computational geometry community. So, but the problem can be slightly more difficult than that because we would like to be able to really distinguish between different configurations in terms of, all these pairwise configurations that you can see. I would like to see them in the metric so that when I extract some statistical features from it based on that metric, I can distinguish between all these configurations. So I, of course, tried with the very basic distance that we all know, which is the power distance, which is indeed positive, negative, either 0 based on some configurations that are interesting, but inside each of these categories, you don't have more refinement, and it's not really the best solution for us. So we had to, as we say in French, réinventer la roue. Well, we had to just come up with a new metric. So it's once you see the definition, it might appear a bit random, but interestingly enough, but by just considering somehow a function that takes into account the extension of 2 disks as well as their overlap with some normalization, etc., one could come up with a nice metric. And for me, at the very first place, that was a very simple and application-driven definition. But this is amazingly strong in terms of capturing geometric configuration between disks. And it has been used during the years for different applications in point process and point pattern synthesis. So it allows you to nicely capture, for example, for such a complex configuration where you have the fruits that need to remain inside the plates, the glasses that should be outside the plates, the Smarties inside, etc. So these are like very, very hard constraints that you cannot necessarily encode in a simple model, but through this nice metric, what we can do is indeed to somehow do a normalization here, first of all, to have like different intervals of values for our metric, and then incorporate that into our PCF signatures in order to apply the very classical point matter synthesis there. So this is the very first simple and intuitive extension that we can think of. The other thing is how to then consider different categories in such configuration. For example, you have Smarties, you have plates, you have glasses. So how to consider these things together? What kind of PCF we will be considering? So this is another thing that we have done. Rather than taking all the possible inter-category, inter-class PCF configurations, what we have done was to just come up with the topology, with the kind of ordering in the categories. For example, when you have such a distribution that may appear quite simple, but in order to handle that automatically, what you need to do is to come up with an order. For example, first place the, let's say, these ones that are inside these clusters. Once they are nicely synthesized from a statistical point of view with their own PCF, then you can just gather all the others around them, etc., etc. So this order of PCF consideration was important, and considering not a complete graph in this, having the nice, optimized one was something that we could handle nicely in order to do what? To do this kind of complex data synthesis. This is an ecosystem with 9 classes indeed that you can see in different colors. And if you consider this kind of different PCF with respect to different categories in a specific order, for example, the biggest canopies are placed first, and then the smaller one, etc., etc., that would give you a kind of tree there. And based on that tree, you will have 45 PCFs that would give you these features. So now you can forget about your input and try to target these PCFs by doing dart throwing. It's not very efficient in terms of algorithm. This is one of the first algorithms that we had. But interestingly enough, these PCFs are good enough to capture the statistical features, because once you just render it, you see that, at least for the application that we had in mind, it was one of the best solutions. So then, considering this kind of techniques, you can integrate that into other, let's say, authoring system, where you can just have some keyframes that are given by the user in an interactive manner, and then you will try to extract the statistical information from each of these keyframes and then adapt it to the target number of animals while considering, matching the orientation field that you have based on the terrain and all the other features that come from the type of animal that you have. For example, for wolves, you will have different distribution compared to, I don't know, elephants, etc. Considering these kind of things, we just continued the application of these techniques. And this is just a representative slide to tell you that while you integrate that into a kind of complete framework, and this is what we have done, you could really instantiate an ecosystem with nice food chain. Again, it's not a precise simulation. You cannot use that for to do a specific analysis on food chain between different animals. It's a consistent one. It's one possible consistent food chain instantiation that would allow you to populate the whole virtual world with the corresponding flora and fauna that are somehow interactively editable. And here is an example that you can see. So side by side, the synthetic example image that we had from Grand Canyon and a real photo, you see that even the kind of, that was just a validation step. We wanted to see, based on the ecosystem and food chain that we have developed, if we just compute the movement on different herds, animal herds, from one source to the other, and we compute the most popular, let's say, path for those, and show them if they would match with really path that we can see that are taken by animals, and this is indeed a good validation that was done also by paleontologists in Total as collaborators. So, but indeed, this is just a part of the work. The problem is not over, because as you can see here, what happens is that in all these representations, for example, we have considered the ecosystem data given by the biologists, so where the categories are known. So that can be sometimes a quite strong hypothesis, because finding in a kind of complex discrete distribution, finding and identifying the different categories, it's a challenging question. So the idea would be to come up with a system that would allow us to find them properly. Again, for example, in this context, using the metric that we have developed, is there any clustering system, clustering algorithm that would allow us to do it? For example, a density-aware clustering technique would work here. We have shown that, surprisingly, at least in this context, the ones that we knew are not really able to do it. So we had to come up with a solution, and it's indeed a work that I cannot present here. It will be presented in 1 month in SIGGRAPH Asia, so it's a very new work that we have done. But just to give you an idea of what we can done here, the idea is to indeed have a kind of stability incorporated neighborhood graph that we have mentioned here. We called it SING. Why? Because we are able to define indeed a new proximity definition between points. Here, these are disks, so it doesn't matter. These are the elements that we will be considering. So rather than having, for example, the nearest neighbor graph as proximity criterion, what we will do here is to say that indeed 2 points A and B will be connected to each other. In this case, for example, 2 disks would be in the same cluster, let's say, if their distance, whatever distance you would like to consider, that could be the distance that we have in this case, is less than a parameter epsilon times the distance of each of these points to its nearest neighbor, based on that metric. So the interesting thing is that indeed it provides you a flexibility somehow in terms of considering the density in the proximity criterion that you have, which is surprisingly new and was not done before. And in order to find, to make it stable in terms of this choice of parameter, what we have done was to simply consider this, this new dissimilarity semi-metric. It's not a metric, it's a semi-metric. And so you see that if you consider now this semi-metric here, what will happen is that, so we want this to be less than epsilon, so you can take this as a generalization of, like as an epsilon neighborhood definition, and apply the basic like Rips filtration context to have topological data analysis here. So sorry, I will go quite fast in this part, but it's just to tell you that you can incorporate some stability results in this kind of clustering techniques through tools that exist in topological data analysis. So it's what we will obtain using this persistent diagram, for example, toolbox that we have. So we have used Goody here. So by here I show how increasing this epsilon value could lead to different clustering. So each different clusters are colored in random colors. And you can see that for like low value of epsilon, you have almost isolated categories, clusters. But as far as you just increase this value, you can end up with the clustering that that turns out to be the most stable one in the topological analysis. And this would be indeed the nice clustering that we had in mind. So it's using classical clustering techniques. Surprisingly, we cannot necessarily obtain this kind of approaches. So if there's any questions, I can come back to it, of course, with pleasure, because there are many things to be said here, of course, that I don't have time to mention. So this brings me to another, let's say, challenge that we have considered. That was the case of really high order synthesis. How to consider now really complex data such as this one, where you have not only different classes, you can have also different scales. In the same class, you can have different scales, different orientation, they can overlap, etc., etc. So that was, I remember, the very challenging example that we have given to ourselves. How to come up with a system that would be able to capture the statistical features here in that context. So, for example, the idea would be to come up with such a result. So, and this is what we have obtained, but how can we just consider this? First of all, I would like to mention very first limitation of what I have presented so far on PCF-based methods. Interestingly enough, for PCF methods, the basic distributions such as grids are the most tricky one. I mean, the trickiest one, why? Because the structures are very, very hard to encode using like average density features, right? So these kind of signatures are bad in just representing structures or any kind of anisotropy, okay? So these are good only for stationary or isotropic distributions, which means that if your data is invariant under translation or orientation, then you are perfectly fine. But as soon as you have a structure which appears, for example, in this case, then you are not good, and that will be tricky. So the best technique that existed before was what we call, that was in 2019, that was based on what we call VGG features. The idea is very simple. Indeed, what they were doing was to rasterize the point pattern that they had. So they have now an image, and they just used an image classifier network there in order to do let's say, the synthesis that we wanted to have. The analysis on the raster as the image is done, and then they come back to the space of point patterns. So, so it's a very deep convolutional network, and again, it has some advantages, but since it's very restricted to image representation, the multi-class and multi-attribute patterns are not nicely handled. So we came up with, again, in this context of example-based approaches, we wanted to have something kind of simple, accessible, in the sense that we didn't want to have any training here. But we just got inspired from these convolutional layers that are used in machine learning in order to indeed come up with a model that would extract all the features from the patterns that we had. So that was through Gabor filters. So what we had done was indeed to take into account the Gabor, let's say, filters. So we have really random filters. So we are trying to really find any existing anisotropy in the corresponding point pattern. And then really we are doing the same computation as in a kind of CNN network to come up with what? Some gram matrices that we will use as in our loss function. And once we have this loss function, we will just simply do an optimization. So again, it remains an example-based one. So it's a very light learning somehow technique where you start from, let's say, kind of uniform distribution here. And based on this gram matrices and correlation loss that you have just computed, you try to converge just to the one that you wanted. So I'm not saying that this is the best in terms of structure capturing, but it's still very convenient, at least compared to the one that would require a quite large training here. And of course, since we are just using Gabor filters, we can just concatenate them. These Gabor maps can be concatenated to have multi-class and multi-attribute data, so we are able to handle them for the first time with many classes, and it's how we come up with this kind of data from very simple and quite complex data set we are able to synthesize such a thing with all the associated attributes to them. But it remains quite slow yet, in the sense that although we are at least 8 times faster than, let's say, the existing related work, what takes us quite some time is all this computation of Gabor maps on this data, etc., etc. So it's not really convenient for interactive, let's say, synthesis, if there is a real-time application. But in case this time computation time is not important, it's quite interesting approach. So it's why, at some point, we asked ourselves, what about like interactive application and encoding very efficiently, let's say, anisotropy in such a context? So here you see the example that we have considered from a biology book. We took such a simple exemplar, and we just provided a sketch-based toolbox to just generate something from this. And the idea now is to extend this in a higher domain, in a bigger domain. So this is what we call interactive discrete distribution synthesis, while considering really all the statistical, let's say, features of this. Even though they are not really precisely replicated, we want them to be at least quite similar for interactive tools. So surprisingly enough, there is, at least we couldn't come up with finding such a thing in the literature. So that would be able to, for example, do this kind of simple extensions. And here is a very quite simple, but I find it quite elegant solution to that. We are suggesting from a very simple exemplar, for example, a sketch like this, to have a fine to coarse analysis. So the idea is to gather, indeed, all the small elements based on their supporting linear directions, let's say. The very first place we try to simplify, we try to just cluster based on the direction of each of these elements, and we try to really make it coarser and coarser so that at the very end we end up with really some what we call lead directions. And in the synthesis part, what we will do is to just replicate this from coarse to fine. So, and then generate elements in a hierarchical way to obtain such a result. So this is a very geometry-based solution to a problem that can be then used quite efficiently in other contexts. For example, we have applied it to biological scenarios. So where we are really, the biologists are really able to do a kind of, to have a narration, indeed it's a narrative system. From simple sketches, they are able to explain their ideas to other scientists or their students, and the interface really allows them to somehow simplify the communication, either between researchers or for educational purposes, etc., etc. And the key idea here again is to keep it light in terms of training. We have no training, it's example-based and just based on geometric modeling. So what I would like to really, again, insist on is the fact that we can make the best use of just incorporating geometrical or statistical features into a model that takes them into account and come up with a solution. And really at the place where there is no solution and we are not able to simply model these things, we can of course use the current tools in machine learning and even deep networks that exist. And this is indeed something that we had to go through for our, let's say, final application in that context, or final goal, let's say, because the applications are uncountable. So in terms of pattern editing, we have how to provide a tool that would allow us to do this kind of addition on point patterns very simply, because working with these point patterns, trying to replicate all these statistical features, etc., is something for which we could propose some solutions, but how to make like simple changes like this in an interactive manner. So it seems quite impossible, except if we come up with some geometric solution or idea. So in order to present the solution that we are suggesting, I need to just come back to some basic notions. Indeed, a point pattern is consists of density plus correlation. For example, if you look at this this point pattern, you can see that it's indeed blue noise mainly, so it's spatially varying density, but the correlation between the points is exactly the same. So if I wanted to show just the density map of this, that would correspond to this one. So, and you see that these are indeed almost the same correlation, the same, for example, the PCF of these two would match, although the densities are different. So now in this one, it's indeed the density which is completely constant, but you can see that the correlations are different, and of course the appearance of the two are really, really different. And these are the four, for example, different correlations that you can see, and to each of those, for example, we can associate different PCFs. And here is a new one where you have both of them varying. So this is the density map, and there is, of course, the correlation, which is there. So how to play with these elements in an interactive manner and change them, through a toolbox. So related work on this are quite limited. I think, again, it's based mainly on this work that I mentioned, 2012, where they work on the space of PCFs, and they try to find an embedding that would allow them to have this kind of representation. So they are not really convenient in the sense that they are not perceptual driven, and they are very limited in terms of the exemplars that they are considering. So you can read more about the details and differences that and the comparisons that we have in the corresponding paper that we have. But what we have suggested at the end was to indeed control these patterns through colors, in the sense that in addition to the density map that we have, we will associate to each of these patterns the color. And that would be a kind of change of space where in order to edit a point pattern, you can go through, you can transfer it to the space of images, use popular image editing software such as Photoshop, etc., and then come back to your space of point patterns. So how can we do that? Because the space of correlation is very unknown, and it should be very high dimensional. So the idea that we had was to just have what we call a perceptual point correlation embedding. For this, we started to generate like random PCFs. So not all of them are meaningful indeed, but based on that, we tried to render these PCFs. So using our optimization synthesis techniques, we just render the corresponding point patterns. So, and based on that, indeed, we use these famous VGG features in order to generate, indeed, all the feature maps that were proposed on that work. So we compute the ground matrices, etc., in order to come up with the similarity matrix. And then so it's a dissimilarity matrix that could represent a very high dimensional space. And what we do is indeed to apply a MDS multidimensional scaling technique in order to really embed it in a 2D lattice space. Okay, so the idea would be what? Then the idea would be to say that this space of correlations is embedded in this two-dimensional space. So we did our best in order to just preserve the distances between two different correlations in that weird space of correlations, so that the corresponding 2D distance match nicely enough the distances between them, based on these VGG 19 features. So I should say that still theoretically we don't know what's this big dimension big D. We don't know what's the exact dimension of correlation. It's very, very I mean, it's not well known, of course. And here is what we came up. So I just try to explain to you what's going on here. So this is the embedding, where let's say each position represents a correlation. We try to just represent them through local, let's say each local neighborhood represents a correlation, and you see that they are just changing over this 2D domain. And for example, if you map them, I mean, to a 2D color space, then for example, the one which is here would be this one, the one which is here corresponds to the blue noise, etc., etc. So you can see that this is indeed an embedding which allows us to just map different colorations to different point patterns. And how the things are working now, we are just using Scilab color space, in the sense that we use one channel to just to represent the density, and one for the correlations. And then, given any input, we are able to just find the corresponding image. In that case, it's a single correlation. There is no varying correlation here. And we can edit it through, for example, Photoshop, to just come up with a new point pattern with different techniques. So using that, we can, of course, make the best use of all the existing tools, for example, in texture synthesis, to handle such tricky cases like this via images. Although, if we wanted to just focus on the point pattern techniques, the result would been really, really bad. So through this, not only we can do just from a given color, image synthesized point pattern, we can also, as I said, modify these things. And for this, indeed, we came up with the bilateral estimation of this, because when you are given such a point pattern to the network, this color correspondence is not necessarily computed. What you need to do is to compute the corresponding correlation without any a priori information about the neighborhood. So on the transition phases, you need to come up with a kind of bilateral definition of the corresponding PCFs in order to be able to come up with the right image. So it's what we have used. You can find more details there, or if there is any question. And here is a video, if it works. Okay, so sorry, I will just stop it here, because there is another application on which we are currently working, and we have a PhD which is starting on this topic, is on the usage of these techniques for generating tactile supports for visually impaired people. So the idea is to somehow extend the discrete setting of Braille language, which is very limited, and with some extensions that are still limited to a continuous Braille that represents such a thing. So I can talk about it for more than 2 hours, because it may appear very, very simple, but there are so many tricky practical things and problems and challenges that is really, I just realized that we are far from having a good solution. But the good point is that with being in contact with real users and the corresponding institutions such as INSEA, we are really able to identify the big challenges and provide, hopefully one day, nice solutions to that. So I would like to finish my talk now by just insisting somehow on 4 different axes here, at least in the kind of research that we are trying to offer and follow all together. It's just the fact that I'm personally appreciating whatever I would call is intuitive, accessible method, in the sense that we can easily present them, we can easily apply them to different contexts, and have a good feedback and evaluation from the applicative context there. And the fact that we are using perception, at least in the very last project, leads me to new long-term research, which is multisensory human-based model. I didn't have time to really detail what I mean by that, but I would be happy to talk about it during our offline discussions. And there are many, many things that can be done here, and for this we obviously need to have more and more interdisciplinary collaboration. This is a good opportunity for me to thank all of my collaborators, and namely the ones who were involved in this part of the research. So these are the references. And I thank you for your attention, and would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for the very nice talk. Do you have any questions? We have time for questions.
Thanks a lot for the talk. How do you validate when you have this distribution and you generate distribution? How can you estimate the quality of this?
A very good question. Thank you so much. So, yeah, this is a nice and perfectly relevant question. The fact is that, okay, so let me just go back to the right. So the only manner, at least, that we have to evaluate the quality of distribution synthesis would be through the two categories of signatures that we know. Either we go through the spectrum and we try to see if the spectrum matches, or we go through the PCF kind of signatures to see if we have a good. So, and surprisingly, I mean, there is no other really confirmed or more formal way of evaluating, namely in the case of anisotropic cases. In the case of anisotropic cases, even these ones are not meaningful at all. So what we have done, for example, in the case of interactive application, for example, here, was to of course, do an evaluation based on whatever we can find in terms of geometric features, distance to the closest one, variance within a kind of category, etc., etc. And then what we do usually is user studies. That's what we do usually, and that's the best thing that we have found. So it's for these kind of features, but there is no really measure, and we even see it more in the haptic, in the tactile world that we are considering now. This is amazing how we lack formal definitions of measurements and metrics. So it's what we need to do all in this community. Thank you.
Another question?
In the cases where you have many examples of the base distribution that you're trying to. Sure. So when you have many examples of a base distribution that you're trying to imitate, could you maybe try it would not be a formal definition, but for example have some kind of adversarial approach where you train from some kind of convolutional neural network to distinguish between the base distribution and the one you've output with your method, and see how good it is at distinguishing as kind of a proxy of how well you've done? As in, if it cannot distinguish at all between the two, it's not a sufficient condition. But if it's very good at distinguishing between what you've output, and then you could say that you have not done so well.
So yeah, if I understand well, it's still in the following the same question as before. It's in terms of validation, like the comparison.
Yes, sorry, I should have given the.
Yeah, of course, indeed, what exists and is indeed a very good. At least a very good validation tool is this VGG9 features. These are what we call perception-based metric, and these are indeed based on what you have said. They try to learn how similar are to, and it's indeed what we have used, as I said, in our embedding for point patterns to just say how similar two patterns are to each other, etc. So this is the only somehow tool that we had before. Which is quite powerful. I'm not saying that it's not powerful at all, because if you see all the, the set of point patterns that they can handle and how similar they look to each other, I mean, it's quite promising. So if I show, for example, again, I go back to this example. This one is very tricky. I'm showing them like this, discrete distribution. It doesn't seem so tricky to you, but it's really challenging, and they are able to handle that. So this is a good tool indeed.
Other questions? I have one.
Sure.
It's a what-if question. What if instead of using points to represent a density map, you have straight lines?
Sure. This is a great question.
Yeah.
We have worked on that. So, in terms of linear hierarchical, linear supporting hierarchical systems, so we have used this one, so you have linear things. But for example, in terms of segments, we have considered also distribution of segments, where you need to, of course, encode the orientation as well as the length of the segments there. So it, of course, adds another dimension to your setting, and you need to be able to handle that. So there is, in theory, there is no problem, and we can handle this. The fact, I mean, for these kind of applications, again, the ground truth study, acquisition, etc., is very, very hard. I mean, for example, we worked, so I'm talking about one of our current projects on sketch-based modeling. We are working on artist sketches where they usually use all these segments to just come up with an overall shape. The fact is that they are very, very complex in the sense that there are too much overlap. Some of them are curvy, they are not necessarily, so of course you need to take care of all these things. There are some work, and we are trying to extend them, but a clean distribution of segments, we know how to handle them. You just augment, lift your data to a higher dimensional space. We are indeed working on other powerful tools also in order to just represent them with the existing tools using Lie groups, etc., in order to consider this in a more efficient manner. So we can do things on that, but again, application contexts are quite challenging in terms of data segmentation itself, to be able to show the applicability of the results.
Thank you very much. Maybe one last quick question. Otherwise, we just go for the coffee break.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, coffee break.